and I'm excited to be joining our guest today, United States Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, Massachusetts Representative Ayanna Pressley, and Los Angeles Unified School District Board member Nick Mavoyne. They're here to talk about the issue of police in schools, what can be done about it, and the bill just introduced today by Senator Murphy and Representative Pressley, the Counseling Not Criminalization Act, that works to incentivize support services for students and address the growing problem of police officers in schools. According to a 2016 report from the National Center for Education Statistics, 43% of public schools across the country have armed police officers present regularly. The New York Times reported that police in-school programs are expanding despite a lack of research on them or evidence that they work. Experts, including the RAND Corporation, a conservative think tank, say there's no evidence that armed school police prevent school shootings. Instead, researchers have found major problems with school police. The presence of police exacerbates racialized trauma and fuels the school-to-prison pipeline by increasing the likelihood that incidents are reported to police. Black and brown students are disproportionately more likely to be reported than white students for the same incident. A Black student is 2.3 times more likely to be arrested than a white student, and Black and brown students are more likely to be arrested even though they do not misbehave more than white students. A 2016 report from the White House found that students of color are 20 to 40% more likely than white students to attend a school with a police officer present, but no guidance counselor or on staff. As the Center for American Progress has found, 27 million children across the country are living with psychological and emotional trauma, but do not have access to a school psychologist. But research on best practices in education suggests that students need more targeted resources and support services, not law enforcement. Senator Murphy and Representative Pressley's proposed Counseling Not Criminalization Act would prohibit federal funding for school police and reward schools that transition to providing critical services like counseling to students. Senator Chris Murphy, thanks so much for joining us. You've talked about the outrageous consequences of police in schools, including the arrest of a 6-year-old Black girl arrested for a minor altercation in Orlando, Florida. Can you tell us about the impact school police have on students and families and why it is so important to get police out of schools?
Having both myself and Ayanna on today, and we're glad to be able to talk to you about our legislation and talk a little bit about the impact it may have specifically in the school district of Los Angeles. You have to have a pretty strong stomach to watch some of the videos that are online today, displaying some of the worst abuses caught on video with respect to police officers in schools. And I care about this issue because I've watched the data, I've seen the videos, but also because I'm married to someone who spent 10 years of her life as a legal aid lawyer representing children in Connecticut. And I'll never forget one story that my wife, Kathy, brought home with her. She was representing a young man, a 10th grader in a school in a small city in Connecticut. And this young man had a habit of walking out of class in the middle of his class and wandering the halls. And every time he did it, he'd get suspended for a few days and he'd be sent home to his grandmother, whom he lived with. And this cycle repeated itself so often during the beginning of his 10th grade year that he had been out of school, suspended for more days than he was in school. And one day when he was once again stopped in the hallway by an assistant principal, he got angry and he got into a verbal argument with this assistant principal. Well, there was a police officer in the school as well, a school resource officer who responded to this verbal argument and arrested the kid for disorderly conduct. He had gotten into an argument with a principal in the hallway, and all of a sudden, the 16-year-old kid was in the court system. Well, it turned out this kid didn't know how to read. The reason he was walking out of class in the middle of the day is because he couldn't follow the lesson. He was so mortally embarrassed that rather than having to go through the embarrassment of being called on and not know what the hell they were talking about, he walked out of class. And this was a school, as it turned out, that had made the decision to invest in police officers who were arresting kids for verbal altercations instead of support services that could actually help a 10th grader learn how to catch up with his classmates. And so to me, that is a prime example of how we've gone wrong here. We've loaded up our schools with police officers at the expense of the support services that actually make schools safe places to be and positive places to learn. And so I certainly come from a state that has had great tragedy inside a school. Lots of schools in my state loaded up on security officers and police officers after Sandy Hook. But we have enough data now, and you referenced it, John, to tell us that in fact, those police officers don't make schools safer. In fact, they often make the schools much less safe. And as Ayanna and others will talk about, it ends up that students of color are getting targeted. And it is not a coincidence that if you're a student of color, you are going to be 2 to 3 to 4 to 6 times more likely to be arrested for one of these common, misbehaviors in school than a white student, largely because you have police officers there to target you. So I'm really excited about this legislation. It supports work that's already happening out there. Lots of big school districts are ending their relationship with police departments, and I hope that the funding that we're going to provide in our bill to help schools make that transition will give more schools and more school districts the confidence to engage in this discussion.
Thanks so much, Chris. Now you've been very supportive of parents in your state and in your former congressional district that have really experienced the trauma that you mentioned previously. What has your response been to any of them who have been calling for more school police and more law enforcement involvement?
Well, quickly, 2 responses. One, I point them to the data. We now have enough of it. You mentioned the RAND study. We have a local study in Connecticut from New Haven that shows that putting uniformed armed police officers in school actually doesn't make schools safer. And there's almost no examples of these officers stopping school shootings. In fact, some of the most infamous school shootings happened despite the fact that there were uniformed police officers. But I do have a lot of white parents who say to me, hey, we love the police officer in our school. That officer is there to protect us. And this is an issue in which there is often a real disconnect between how white students and white parents view police officers in their school, who are by and large not arresting their kids, and how Black parents and Latino parents view and students view these police officers who are, unfortunately harassing these kids a lot of times and targeting them for arrest. And so part of it is having a conversation with parents in Newtown or in other suburban environments in Connecticut to say, hey, listen, they're not making you safer, and your experience is not the same as the experience of these kids. These kids that, by the way, you've been standing up and supporting through the Black Lives Matter protests over the course of the last several months. If you really mean what you say in supporting this movement, then here's a way you can do it.
Yeah, thanks so much for connecting those issues. I'd love to get back to that topic after bringing Ayanna in to talk about the work that you've done with Representative Ilhan Omar, introducing an amendment to the House Democrats' Justice and Policing Act that would eliminate federal funding for training or hiring school police. Ayanna, what made that amendment necessary, and why did you want to do a new bill on this particular topic?
Yeah, well, we find ourselves at a moment of reckoning when it comes to racial justice, and this is a racial justice issue, given the disproportionate rates of expulsion, suspension, and discipline that Black and Brown students experience, and in particular, Black and Brown students living with disabilities. So communities across the country at this moment of reckoning are pushing back against the over-policing and the criminalization of Black and Brown communities. And we must also end the mass criminalization and punishment of Black and Brown children, again, including those with disabilities in our schools. So this is exactly the time, I've been quoting Reverend Barber a lot lately, who said we find ourselves in the midst of a reckoning, which requires a reconstruction. And so this is the time to rebuild our learning communities and to invest in what we know actually makes those communities safer. And my work on this predates my time in Congress. When I was on the Boston City Council, often confronted with these unjust binary choices, I voted down, 3 municipal budgets because I was not going to fund more school police or any school police when we didn't even have equitable access to a school nurse. So again, we know what works, what supports these learning communities being safe and healthy environments where young people can thrive. We just have not made those investments. And so this is the time to make those investments. And I'm very grateful for the partnership of Chris on this. The Counseling, Not Criminalization in Schools Act is bold. It will disrupt the school to confinement pathway by prohibiting federal funds from being used to over-police and criminalize our students, and again, instead support schools that choose to invest in the trauma-informed personnel. The story that Chris just shared, if these were restorative justice or trauma-informed learning communities, then an educator would be equipped with the skills and the training to ask that student, not what's wrong with you, what happened to you? And so I see these issues as interconnected and intertwined, both the criminalization of students in our schools and also the issues of police reform and police brutality, which is why I did introduce that amendment during the Justice and Policing Act introduction. Unfortunately, we're unable to get that to the floor, but that's why I'm now following up with this bill with the senator. And prior to that, I introduced the End Push Out Act to stop the criminalization of Black girls in our schools and to disrupt the school to confinement pathway. And I do just want to give it up to my thought leader in this work, Dr. Monique Morris. Shout out to A-Team alum, Lanice Wallace as well. Dr. Morris from the National Black Women's Justice Institute, asked that we not even refer to it as the school to prison pipeline. She said this is a pathway because it's a confluence of choices made that were non-linear. And so we find ourselves in this crisis based on the choices of lawmakers and those charged with overseeing our budgets. And so now we should incentivize them to make different choices.
So what do those choices look like? Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the federal government and local decisions? We'll get to Nick in a little bit, but just can you explain in practice how this bill would work?
Sure. What it does is it incentivizes those schools to, instead of investing in school police and the militarization and the criminalization of students, to invest in those supports that we know support an environment being one that is free from fear and safe, where students can learn and they can thrive. And those are the investments in, again, trauma-informed practices, personnel, school nurses, social workers, psychotherapists, to name a few. And so again, we find ourselves in the midst of this reckoning. But the only thing that matters in this moment of reckoning is how we legislate and what we codify in our budgets. And so we have to shift our priorities here. And instead of the federal government subsidizing the over-policing of our kids and exacerbating the school to confinement pathway, our bill, counseling, not criminalization, would support schools that choose to invest in those counselors, in social workers, in mental health and trauma-informed services instead of police.
Thanks so much, Ayanna. We've been talking a lot on the briefing about budgets and how budgets reflect our values. And so I appreciate you breaking that down. And Nick, I'd like to turn to you and talk about what's happening on the local level in Los Angeles. Can you tell us about why all the services that Ayanna and Chris just mentioned, like why those are so important in Los Angeles right now?
Yeah, and thanks, John, for having me. This is personal for me. I grew up on the west side of LA, a predominantly white community where I went to schools without police. And then I taught in South LA at a school that was exclusively students of color where there were police. And that's the systemic injustice and systemic racism right there. I think the context is important. We in LA since the 1980s have run the largest school police department in the nation. A lot of districts have contracted with municipal police departments, and they're, I think, wisely severing those ties. Minneapolis, Portland, Denver. We have no contracts with LAPD, and that's something I'm proud of. Other districts like New York are kind of moving to what we had in LA prior to this recent reform, which is in New York, they're moving the school police mechanism from the NYPD to the Department of Education. So we might have had a best practice in LA when it comes to law enforcement, but it's the practice that's being questioned. And the reason that I supported our efforts and voted to divest from school police was because this moment, this reckoning is asking for us to reimagine safety. Safety to whom, for whom, from whom. And I think, as my colleague said, when law enforcement is the one tool you have, you will avail yourself of that tool. And I saw that as a middle school teacher in Watts. When a student talked back, you call the school police officer. Well, if that tool was removed from the equation and instead you had a counselor or a psychiatric social worker or a teacher's aide or a nurse, and instead of calling the law enforcement because the student was caught with marijuana or because the student was acting up, as the senator was mentioning, because he or she can't read. Instead, you called the specialist. We can shift that paradigm. And so in LA, we need to replace those tools because our student to counselor ratio is well over 500 to 1. Our student to psychologist ratio is well over 1,000 to 1. And it does come down to investments and incentives. And that's why I'm grateful to my colleagues on this in this conversation about this bill and this legislation, because one of the sobering points that was brought up in our 24 hours really of debate around school police were that even if we eliminated the entire security apparatus at our schools, it would barely be enough to put one other counselor at half of our schools in Los Angeles. And so we need to think about how do we incentivize districts like ours to invest in those nurses and counselors and psychiatric social workers. We also have to look beyond school policing. I think that the reforms that we've undertaken in LA are necessary, but not sufficient. If we're really talking about school districts dismantling white supremacy and systemic racism, our school police budget is about 0.8%. And so while this is an important first step, I really hope that districts like ours and others around the country will look at what we're teaching, who are in front of our students, and this is part of it. But I just want to make that point as well.
Thanks so much. Now, I asked a similar question to Chris. How are you dealing with questions from your parents, especially in your district, people that are questioning some of these decisions? And how are you making that direct connection to, well, if you value Black lives and you're in the streets protesting, really connecting the dots between these issues?
Yeah, and I joined the board a couple of years ago, and a few months after was the Parkland tragedy, and so there were a lot of calls there from my constituents on the west side and the Valley of Los Angeles for increased policing, and I rejected that effort, and instead I passed a resolution at the board that created a school safety task force to work with our communities to figure out, again, the beginning of this conversation about redefining safety. And so I think, like the senator was mentioning, looking at the data. We, including Parkland, which unfortunately is, proves the point that having a safety officer on campus doesn't necessarily prevent school shooting. But looking at the statistic that the vast majority of school shootings and school violence are for students who were bullied out, counseled out, pushed out. And so how do we invest in those resources? I also think that I've been trying to delineate for my constituents the difference between external security and on-campus discipline. And the problem, and I like the kind of multidimensional idea of a pathway instead of a pipeline that Congresswoman Presley was speaking about. But the problem is when those are intermingled, the discipline function is done by law enforcement. And so, we're having other conversations in LA about our municipal police force, but I understand that we have to have security protocols to make sure that our students and our campuses are safe. But when those are on campus, they have more of a discipline role. And so like the senator was saying, I think we're asking people to live their values, and those of us who have been marching in the streets for Black lives need to understand how integral school policing is to this larger conversation.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us. So before turning to the next question, I'd like to highlight that a report from Professor Emily Hughes with the Justice Collaborative and Data for Progress concludes that removing police from schools and investing those resources into targeted, evidence-based resources for students can help schools meet the needs of students. Mental health services, guidance counseling, and other supportive services would help improve student success relative to policing. Also, new polling suggests that 6 in 10 voters support investing more money in supportive services, even if it means cutting the number of police in schools. How have each of you seen conversations on school police evolve over the past few years? Chris, we could start with you.
Sure. Yeah, as I said, this is a difficult conversation in Connecticut because there was a rush to put police in schools in my state after Sandy Hook, I think, as I said, a lot of it is really doing the hard work of explaining to people what the differing realities often are in terms of how police interact with students and how many kids in this country are going to school in a place without a school counselor. The reality is, in a lot of those more affluent school districts, they have better experiences with police, but that also might not be coincidental to the fact that they have enough money to have support services and guidance counselors and social workers and psychologists. They have that that buffer, that cushion for kids that need help. And that just doesn't exist in school districts that are straining for resources and are dealing with a host of additional traumas. And so I think that this again, coming back to this term that Ayanna is using and challenging us to use, this reckoning, is an opportunity to explain these very different realities. I think people's sort of eyes have been opened here, and we need to use it as an opportunity to do some pretty serious education. And again, we have this data now that we didn't have right after Sandy Hook. We have data now that shows us that no, in fact, police officers don't stop mass shooters. And in fact, those kids are frankly less likely to ever become a reality in your school if you're able to surround every student with the kind of resources that make people feel included, less isolated, and less prone to the kind of ostracization that creates an impulse in someone to do something rash.
Thanks, Chris. Now, I know you have to run for a floor vote soon. I want to give you an opportunity for any final reflections for our viewers before you have to jump off, just in case.
Well, I'm just so grateful to be doing this with Ayanna. I've been a big fan of her since she arrived here, and I think that this is just incredibly vital work. And it is a way to address this larger pathway that she talked about. She has done, she mentioned it, this tremendously important work on push out in general. School-based arrests are sort of the worst thing that can happen to you if you're in school, but suspensions and expulsions aren't far behind. And so maybe this is an opportunity to have a conversation that ends up including one in which we really challenge all administrators and all parents to think about the way in which we overly use these kind of disciplinary measures to police behaviors that are much better dealt with through other prisms. If we get police out of schools, that still will leave a lot of kids being pushed out through school discipline. That is a different kind of problem, but one that we have to attack as well. The statistics we're talking about in terms of Black and brown kids being discriminately treated with respect to arrests, they're the exact same when you look at suspensions and expulsions. And so hopefully this moment will allow us to have that broader conversation, and Ayanna has done a lot of great work on that.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate your time, and whenever you have to jump, we totally understand.
Yeah. Grateful for your partnership on this, Chris.
Thanks, Ayanna.
Ayanna, Chris is talking about a lot of work you've already done on this. Can you connect all the dots for our viewers and how this issue ties into other work you've been doing and just the trauma that these communities are facing? I mean, and even more trauma in the age of COVID.
Yeah, well, exactly. So first, let me offer some historical contextualizing here. I've heard it said that adults don't make mistakes, they make choices. And so adults in their lawmaking and in what we prioritize in our budget, we have made the choice to over-police and militarize our schools and to disproportionately, in a targeted and very precise way, to criminalize Black and brown children. And we have consciously made the choice. For the last 2 decades especially, the federal government has invested $1 billion, that's with a B, to support the hiring of police in our schools. And so now we have more than 46,000 school police across the country, while at the same time, 90% of our students go to school where the number of counselors, social workers, psychologists, and school nurses do not meet the required standards. So this isn't a matter of deficit. This is a matter of prioritization and of alignment of our values. And what is good for our babies is good for our budgets. And we have not been good to our babies. Paraphrasing Frederick Douglass, who reminds us it's better to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I also just want to acknowledge, as we talk about the evolution of this debate and the dog whistles and the stereotyping that persists here, over the last 50 years, our nation's public schools have become sites for increased criminalization and surveillance of young people, especially Black, Native, Latinx, immigrant, students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and other historically marginalized groups. And our federal government has invested heavily to increase police presence in our schools. And today, again, there are over 46,000 SROs in our schools nationwide. So, but The evidence shows that these officers don't make schools any safer and actually increase physical danger to young people. I want to underscore that. These schools are not more violent. These children are not more violent. These schools are over-policed and militarized, resulting in a criminalization, and the data bears out in the sobering and devastating way. Research has shown us that schools with police officers report nearly 5 times more arrests than schools without police. And again, this isn't because these schools are more likely to have violent crimes, it's because these schools are more likely to use police to respond to otherwise normal childhood behavior. So this is the time for a paradigm shift against the backdrop of this national reckoning on police reform and brutality. These issues are really interwoven and interconnected.
Thanks, Ayanna. Nick, Ayanna made a bunch of great points. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond, based on what you're seeing on the local level too.
No, I mean, again, it's such an honor to just share this virtual stage with the Congresswoman, because she's been such a leader on this. But I think, that this isn't, and I've been trying to make this point to my constituents, this isn't about school safety or not school safety. It is about how we define safety. And it's about equipping our educators with the tools around restorative justice and counseling. And I think that is one of the things that we're going to need increased investments for, because LA Unified led the way in the state of California, and now California has passed legislation to this effect, banning what's called willful defiance, expulsion, or suspension. Willful defiance is talking back. Talking back is, I think, part of the 3rd, 5th, 7th, 8th grade curriculum. Those of us who have been teachers or students know that we talk back. But it was when willful defiance was an allowable grounds for suspension and expulsion, teachers were using it. And then when we got rid of that tool, we had to bring in something better, something else. And that was kind of the restorative justice paradigm, but that requires resources. And I think, it's not mutually exclusive with the focus on school safety. And because Sandy Hook's Promise themselves do a lot around working with investments in school social workers and psychologists. And, by their own data, they're looking at 2,000 or so students who they believe they've prevented death by suicide by just working on those front end supports. And I think the data is important here, because when we hear a lot of these anecdotes about, school police keep our schools safe, I think we need to look at the data. We need to disaggregate it by race, by geography in places like LA. One of my first initiatives on the board was an open data portal so that we could see this in real time. And we also have to realize that this doesn't just start in high school. I mean, Black preschoolers are expelled at 3 times the rate their non-Black peers. I mean, just thinking about why we're even expelling preschoolers for conduct that I think that is just inherent in preschool. So, I think having these conversations, looking at what the tools are available. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And if we just remove police from schools and instead invest in counselors, nurses, and also just arts. I think the senator said it earlier, but one of the first things I learned about discipline when I was a teacher is that when my lessons were more engaging and culturally relevant, my students were better behaved. A lot of the students I saw who are pushed out or who drop out or who are maybe kind of walking down the hallway and then get in that altercation with a school police officer are because they're not engaged in class. And so I think, again, this is a broader conversation about how we're making sure that what we're teaching is relevant and that we're really celebrating our students and building them up, as opposed to every chance we have penalizing them.
I appreciate that. Go ahead, Ayanna.
Oh, I was just going to add and just say, when I think about, what I want for my own daughter, I want her to have a life that is free from fear. And that should certainly be true when we're talking about our learning communities, when we're talking about our schools. So when Black students are arrested at 3 times the rate of white students, and Black girls are arrested at 4 times the rate of white girls, despite making up only 16% of all girls enrolled in schools. This is why I began this work in my time on the Boston City Council with Dr. Monique Morris, to address the criminalization of Black girls in our schools with the End Push Out Act, now that I'm in Congress. But that work started on the council because Black girls were being criminalized just for how they show up, how we wear our hair, body shamed. And when you overlay those experiences, again, I want our children, I want my daughter to have a life that is free from fear, and that should certainly be true within our learning environments. When you overlay that with COVID, I mean, our young people were already crossing a threshold into school, carrying many things in their emotional backpack. growing food insecurity, poverty, exposure to violence, the trauma of experiencing homelessness, gentrification, displacement, fear of deportation. They were already managing all that. Everyone asked me, what should we do about the achievement gap? And I would say, address trauma. Our children cannot have a readiness to learn if they are not whole and they are not healthy. And so ultimately, this is about the public health. And what supports the wellness of our students also supports them in being fully functioning, bringing to bear their full contribution, and having a readiness to learn. So this is a matter of the public health. And again, in the context of COVID and the trauma that they were already experiencing overlaid with this current pandemic, it's really critical that we're making these investments in these social-emotional wellness supports.
Envisioning and thinking about an emotional backpack, that makes it just so real, right? Like you could just envision all the—
they're heavy,
carrying, right? And I could have been that kid, right? Like when we think about our own experiences, the type of experiences some kids have, like that could have happened to me, right? The discipline, being arrested at some point, like all of the things that could happen based on student behavior, right? But instead I had Miss Ritchie who believed me and thought I was smart, and I had school counselors that were available, right? So I think just making it personal and thinking about our own life experiences really helps with all of this.
No, yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, before we close, I know you all are very busy. We like to end on a hopeful note at the briefing. And so, in honor of Representative John Lewis, may he rest in power, I'd like each of you to share how our viewers can get into some good trouble this week.
After you, Congresswoman.
Okay. First, I just want to say that I feel inordinately blessed to have walked this earth the same time as John Lewis, and to walk the corridors of Congress, to have broken bread with him, to have prayed with him, to have been mentored by him, by his example, and also actively. And, John Lewis said, and I'll paraphrase, that if you see something unfair or unjust, you must do something about it, speak up and speak out. And what is happening to Black and Brown students disproportionately in our schools is unjust. It is unfair. Please call your legislator, ask them to support our bill, counseling, not criminalizing. And, we welcome your partnership on this. This is the time. We're in a period of reckoning on racial justice issues in our nation. This is a racial justice issue. Our children deserve to live a life free from fear, including and especially in our schools.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
And I'll just add, in thinking about the legacy of Congressman Lewis, I think of another civil rights leader and a professor of mine in law school, Brian Stevenson. And Brian talks a lot about proximity to injustice. And so I think, in places like LA, unfortunately, it's very easy to be proximate to injustice. You could come to our schools that are underfunded. You could come to our food distribution centers where we're running the largest food bank in the country and see the food insecurity of our community. And so I think that it's important now to not just march when it's convenient, but march when it's difficult, to go and understand what's happening at our schools. And then also something that Professor Stevenson has said, which is that, to change and improve outcomes for kids, we're gonna have to do some uncomfortable things. Voting to divest from school police was a really tough vote for me because of my constituents, because of the individual officers. But ultimately, as Dr. King said, change doesn't roll on the wheels of inevitability. It comes from continuous struggle. And it made me uncomfortable. But as I reflected on that, and I reflected on the good trouble of which John Lewis often spoke, I think that we need to be uncomfortable. And people like me, white, straight elected officials who have had a pretty comfortable life, this is the time to kind of look in the mirror and figure out how to live our values.
I love that. Thanks for channeling Brian Stevens. He would come to our first year law school classes every year, make all of us cry and inspire us to do better. So I appreciate both of you. I also appreciate Senator Murphy for joining us today. I know you are all very busy doing the people's work, so I really appreciate it. To our viewers, thanks so much for joining us. I'm John Matthews. This has been a co-production.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nick. So appreciate your leadership and your partnership on these issues. Always.
And to our viewers, we'll be back tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time with an update about Portland from Commissioner Joanne Hardesty. So again,